Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Game of Thrones video on how much is Stannis to blame. This video is a follow-up to a video I did almost a year ago called It's All Stannis' Fault. If you haven't seen that video, there's a link to it in the description below. You can check that out. So I felt this video deserved a follow-up because this is one of my videos that has the worst like to dislike ratio. At the time of making this video, the It's All Stannis' Fault video has 3,211 views, 36 likes, and 37 dislikes. Most of my videos, the likes far outnumber the dislikes by a very large margin, so this does sort of set it apart. And this doesn't really bother me. Everyone has their opinions. It's more of I find it interesting. Personally, I'm not surprised that it has so many dislikes. I was kind of expecting this as Stannis has a very large, very devoted fan base, so it doesn't surprise me that a video that is highly critical of him would have a lot of detractors. However, I do want to make one thing really clear, and that is I do not hate Stannis. I am not a Stannis hater. When I was reading A Dance with Dragons, I was really rooting for Stannis, and I strongly wanted him to defeat the Boltons and eventually take his rightful place as King of the Seven Kingdoms. So I can understand why a lot of people are really excited about Stannis. He wanted to punish the Lannisters for taking a throne they had no claim to. He wanted to defeat the nasty ass Boltons and to reunite the North under the Starks. All great goals. Plus, you really feel for him, especially reading the books, to hear about how he was mistreated by his brother Robert and not given the due respect that he deserved, as Robert seemed to show favoritism to his spoiled brother Renly. So I do get why someone would really want to root for Stannis. I really do. But when I think about what a rule of Stannis would be like, even book Stannis, I picture Melisandre burning tons of people alive for not following her religion. I think a rigid man who can't see past his own pride, passing up sensible advice. I see a realm divided and a religious war as Melisandre tries to force her religion on a realm unfamiliar with it. And that doesn't sound like a very good rule to me. And yes, I'm talking about Stannis from the books as well. I've heard some people argue that Stannis wouldn't be like that because in the books it's states he doesn't really believe in R'hllor, but that doesn't matter because in the books he lets Melisandre dictate his actions and relies on her to take the throne. So clearly he would continue to rely on her to keep the throne, which means allow her to burn anyone who disagrees with her religion and allow her to wage a religious war. I mean, could you imagine what King's Landing would look like? There'd be people burning alive everywhere. Which leads me to my next point, the difference between the books and the show. As pretty much everyone who disagreed with my video in the comment section overwhelmingly tended to be more familiar with the books than the show. Whereas I myself, particularly at that time of making that video, was far more familiar with the show than the books. And in fact, I think I did undersell that in my video, that it was more about the show than the books, which I should have specified a lot more. However, I will say I disagree with the common line of thinking that the show ruined the character of Stannis and that show Stannis and book Stannis are entirely two different people. While I do agree there are differences between the two, I personally feel that Stannis' fans exaggerate those differences and tend to look on book Stannis with rose-colored glasses and hate show Stannis because his flaws are more obvious and harder to ignore. Whereas I would argue book Stannis' flaws are there too, they're just not as apparent. But I won't get too much into that, as I could take up an entire video just getting into that topic, whereas I'd rather move on to other topics. But if you want to hear more about this, I would suggest watching a video by a channel called Reality Punch Studios, and the video is called Is Stannis a Good Person?, which I thought was a great video that explored this topic in more depth. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to check that out. At any rate, one thing that struck me about my It's All Stannis' Fault video is that never had I gotten so many comments that, in my personal opinion, were very bad arguments. You know, I'm fine with people who want to challenge me. I like hearing other people's opinions, whether I agree with them or not. But pretty much every argument in the comment section would ignore points I made in that video and would argue points that I had already addressed without acknowledging that I had already addressed them. And that's kind of a pet peeve of mine. It's like I say something that dismantles a certain argument and then someone comes along and repeats that same argument without acknowledging I had already addressed it. It almost as if these people didn't even watch my video and were just making comments based on the title alone, which is a common occurrence on some popular YouTube channels I like to frequent, most noticeably the Young Turks, where the majority of comments that are critical of those videos are made by people who haven't watched the video, and it's apparent because their arguments are already refuted by what's in the video. And I gotta say, that annoys me a lot, and I could be wrong, but it seems like people were doing this for my video. They just saw the title, It's All Stannis' Fault, or perhaps watched like 3 minutes of the video, but then went on to attack mode without actually knowing what my argument was. Or at least that's how it seemed to me. I suppose it's possible they simply weren't paying attention to my video. At any rate, the one regret I have is that I engaged with these people in a discussion because I ended up just repeating everything I had already said in the video, but less eloquently. So then they would fire back with more arguments that I had already addressed. So I have decided from now on not to engage with people who do that in my comment section, as you know, if the comment is really bad, I'll just delete it. Otherwise, I'll simply post a time reference to where in the video I had already addressed that argument, rather than simply repeating myself but less eloquently. And to be clear, this is the only video I had this problem with, and I had a lot of comments that had this issue. Not all of them, there were some good ones, but a lot of them. In fact, I have to give a special shout out to Ixkagards, I probably pronounced that wrong, who made a very valid argument against my video. In fact, after the leagues of strawman arguments I got on that video, I was so surprised someone actually made a valid point. I was really impressed, and I had to point this out. His argument was it was more Robert's fault for giving Storm's End to Renly, creating a rift between Stannis and Renly, and that's actually a really good point. Anyway, part of the problem I had with that video could have been because I didn't choose my title very wisely, as the title is misleading, as I don't think everything is Stannis' fault. I do think he has a big share in the blame in the clusterfuck that happened in Westeros, but I don't think he's solely responsible. I think people like Joffrey, Ned, Robb, Tywin, Robert, Renly, and Cersei share a lot of blame as well. But a video called It's Mostly Stannis' Fault, or It's Somewhat Stannis' Fault, doesn't have the same ring to it. I did explain this in that video, however, I think many people either didn't notice or were just too hung up on the title, It's All Stannis' Fault. So in retrospect, I do think I should have went with a different title. Also, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think I stressed enough in that video that it applied mainly to the show, not the books, because I don't think I was aware of it at the time, but I was actually more familiar with the show than the books. I have noticed there are many viewers out there and other YouTubers who are more familiar with the books than the show, and oftentimes they mistake things that happen in the books for things that happen in the show. I try to make a point to never conflate the two, as they are two separate entities and should be judged separately for the most part. When talking broadly about it, it's sometimes okay to talk about both of them at the same time or make a comment that could apply to either one, but sometimes it's worth pointing out the differences between the two, which I failed to do in this video. Although in the video I did point out my argument that Renly would have made an alliance with Robb Stark applied only to the show and not the books, the differences actually went beyond that, and I failed to point that out. My main thesis in that video was Stannis was to blame for what befell Westeros because he killed Renly, and Renly had the might of the Stormlands and the Reach, and in the show would have likely made an alliance with Robb Stark as well, meaning he could have easily defeated the Lannisters and ended Joffrey's reign and brought peace to the Seven Kingdoms. Because by killing Renly, Stannis divided the forces of the Stormlands and the Reach, and in fact sent the forces of the Reach to seek an alliance with the Lannisters, which allowed them to keep their hold on the throne. My argument further supposed that Stannis was not good at playing the Game of Thrones, and in fact sucked at it because he refused to compromise, refused to bend by not even considering the possibility of making an alliance with the North or with Renly, as compared to someone who's good at playing the Game of Thrones like Tywin, who equally had no respect for the Tyrells because they had openly supported Renly, an act of treason in his eyes. However, he was able to put his feelings aside, make an alliance with them because it was the smart thing to do, and in fact, it is what allowed the Lannisters to win the War of the Five Kings. And because Stannis let his pride get in the way and refused to be as wise as Tywin was, he lost the War of the Five Kings. Now, I noticed that pretty much all the comments I got attempting to argue with me ignored the points that I made about Tywin, and instead they all focused on Renly, as in their eyes that was the major flaw in my argument, and this is where the difference between the books and the show comes into play the most. In preparation for this video, I reread A Clash of Kings, and the one thing I noticed was Renly was portrayed very differently from book to show, and I think I kind of underestimated this in my previous video. I think I mentioned that Renly was more arrogant in the books, but I think I kind of understated this. Renly in the show was a much more relatable character and someone you understood better and sympathized with more. Part of the reason for this is because the show changed his character, but the other part was simply that the show explored his character more than the books did. In the books, you have to deal with the device Martin himself has pointed out on many occasions he uses in his books, and that is unreliable narrators, and this certainly comes into play with regards to Renly, as Renly is explored mostly through the viewpoint characters that don't regard him very highly, such as Ned Stark, Catelyn Stark, Maester Cressen, and Davos. Also, we hear a lot of exposition about him through Stannis himself. However, rarely do we get his point of view or the point of view from those that think highly of him, compared to Stannis, who we mostly see through the eyes of Davos, a character that thinks the world of him. And thus the audience might be ready to take Stannis' side over Renly's because of this. However, I do believe one has to take the unreliable narrator element into account. While it's true we later get viewpoint chapters from Brienne, who thinks very highly of Renly, but that's not until the fourth book, well after Renly's death, so that's more of looking back on him in retrospect, once the reader has already made up their mind about him. Plus, Brienne's opinion of Renly is easy to dismiss because it's obvious she's looking at him through the lens of love. Whereas the show, as it does with many minor characters, shows us a lot of Renly through his viewpoint and the viewpoint of other characters who weren't as developed in the books, such as Loras and Margaery. In fact, this was one of the things Martin said he really liked about the show, that it was able to explore more of these minor characters who he wasn't able to get to as much in the books because they didn't have their own viewpoint chapters. And I had noted in my Game of Thrones Season 1 book-to-show comparison video that I felt specifically that Renly's storyline was something the show handled better than the books, because you did get more of an understanding of Renly's perspective, as they had this nice scene with him hunting with King Robert, and where Renly expressed the issues he had with Robert and how he felt that Robert was a horrible king.
Those were the days.
Which days exactly? The ones where half of Westeros fought the other half and millions died? Or before that? When the mad king slaughtered women and babies because the voices in his head told him they deserved it? Or way before that? When dragons burned whole cities to the ground?
Easy, boy. You might be my brother, but you're speaking to the king.
I suppose it was all rather heroic. If you were drunk enough and had some poor Riverlands whore to shove your prick inside and make the 8.
And then we saw his lover Loras tempt him and seduce him into thinking that he could make a better king than Robert ever did. And the thing is, based on what we saw Renly in the show, he's right. As Renly in the show was portrayed as a populist king, a man of the people, someone whom the people loved and would serve the people very well.
Your Grace.
They're right.
How's your foot?
Better, Your Grace. They don't know their own size at all.
Good man.
I understand why those more familiar with the novels wouldn't feel the same way about him, because this is not how he was portrayed in the books. In the books, he came off as a spoiled brat who just got greedy and felt more entitled to things he wasn't entitled to. At least this is how it was described by Maester Crescent.
Even as a boy, Renly had loved bright colours and rich fabrics, and he had loved his games as well. "Look at me!" he would shout as he ran, laughing through the halls of Storm's End. "Look at me, I'm a dragon!" Or, "Look at me, I'm a wizard!" Or, look at me, I'm the rain god!" The bold little boy, with wild black hair and laughing eyes, was a man grown now, 21, and still he played his games. "Look at me, I'm a king," Crescent thought sadly. "Oh, Renly, dear sweet child, do you know what you're doing?"
And Stannis felt this way as well. And the way he treated Catelyn certainly didn't help either. But then again, in the novels, we are only getting one side of the story, but I see why those looking strictly at the novels would think supporting Renly as king would be a bad idea. However, I believe the show purposely played Renly up as someone who would make a better king in order to have his death be more tragic. And the main difference, which I only briefly touched on in my previous video, was that in the show it was highly indicated that Renly was willing to make an alliance with Robb Stark.
Your son can go on calling himself king in the north. The Starks will have dominion over all lands north of Merk Caitlin, provided he swears me an oath of fealty.
And the wording of this oath?
The same Ned Stark swore to Robert 18 years ago. Cat, their friendship held the kingdoms together.
Now, that first line was the same line used in the books. However, the tone and context of the line was completely different. In the novels, Renly was being more arrogant about it and also had a threatening tone like, "Oh, Robb can call himself whatever he likes, but I'm the king." Whereas in the show, it had more of a tone of, well, he can be king of the north as long as he ultimately I'm the king. And the next line he said in the show about Robert and Ned's friendship being the only thing that kept the kingdoms together is something Book Renly would never say, and it completely changed the tone of his previous statement, as it was apparent that show Renly was sincerely reaching out to Catelyn and offering a genuine alliance. As in the novels, Renly had absolutely no interest in an alliance with Robb Stark, and he made that crystal clear. In fact, he even went as far to prevent Catelyn from leaving so that she could see him defeat Stannis in battle in order to send a warning to Robb that what would happen to him if he defied him. So in retrospect, the book Renly was entirely different than show Renly. Again, I think the show purposely made this change to make Renly's death more tragic, because at the moment in the show, you're open up to the possibility of a Stormlands, Reach, and North alliance against the Lannisters. Oh, that's just it. The Lannisters would be done for. I do believe the way the show Renly was being reasonable, that Robb would have definitely gone for an alliance, as he was still officially would be king of the north and wouldn't officially have to declare for Renly, so that would satisfy his honor. And as Renly said himself, the war would be over in a fortnight, and it would have been had that smoke monster not have come up and killed Renly and fucked everything up. And this is the point I was trying to make in my video. However, I should have emphasized a lot more than I did that this applies only to the show, as in the novels it's a totally different scenario. Renly was not willing to make an alliance with the North, and had Stannis not killed him, Robb would have most likely ended up having to war with him as well, which paints an entirely different scenario. Also, it means that Renly was being just as stubborn, thick-headed, and arrogant as Stannis was, so in the novels, he's just as guilty as Stannis. So had Stannis not killed him, the same problem would have existed, but perhaps not on such a massive scale. Which leads me to the next common argument I received on that video, that Renly is not a battle commander and therefore would have lost the Battle of Blackwater, same as Stannis. And in my opinion, this argument is ridiculous. More so in the show than the books, but even in the books, ridiculous. Because so what if Renly isn't a battle commander? That's not what the role of a king is. The primary function of a king is to rule, and as Tywin so eloquently put it in his speech to Tommen in season 4, that a good king is wise, and being strong like King Robert isn't good enough. Now, true, Renly in the books, and perhaps in the show as well, was not that wise, but especially in the show, Renly was a very good politician. He was kind of a good politician in the books because the people of the Reach and the Stormlands were very devoted to him, but the way he was portrayed in the show, through the scenes we saw of him at his camp, they made it very clear he was a good politician, and that matters more than being a good battle commander, because he has others in his army who can do the battle strategy and whatnot, such as Randall Tarley or Loras or other trained and seasoned battle commanders. Sure, they may not be as good as Stannis, but that hardly matters when their army is twice the size, and the Lannisters' army would have been half the size. I'm sorry, but with those numbers, the experience of the battle commander makes very, 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 very little difference. And this is where I feel that these particular commenters were being obtuse by saying Renly couldn't win the battle because the alliance of the Tyrells isn't just the forces of one family, it's the forces of the entire Reach, one of the richest regions of all of Westeros, and it makes a huge difference, a battle-deciding difference. As in the case of Renly versus the Lannisters, the Reach was on Renly's side. Stannis versus the Lannisters, the Reach was on the Lannisters' side. Even in the books, where an alliance between Robb and Renly wasn't a possibility, still, the Reach was the deciding factor in this battle. And some people tried to bring up other factors, such as Tyrion's strategies to use hill tribesmen and whatnot, which, yes, played a factor. But again, the biggest factor, by far, was the Reach. In both the books and the show, the Lannisters would have not won the battle without them, as it was a close call. And now, imagine that the Reach was fighting against the Lannisters instead of for them. Assured defeat. The Lannisters would have had exactly 0% chance of winning. It doesn't matter what the tactics that Tyrion came up with. It doesn't matter how inexperienced battle commander Renly was. The Lannisters wouldn't have had a snowball's chance in hell. And if you refuse to see that, then you're simply being unreasonable, and that's all there is to it. And the other common response I got, to why one shouldn't have supported Renly is because he had no true claim to the throne. And Stannis, by law, was the next in line to be king, not Renly. So, let me be completely frank in my response to this argument. So what? I'm sorry, but if you think that really makes a difference, then you are making the exact same mistake that Ned Stark did, and we all know how well things went for him. I'm frankly surprised that people who live and were raised in a modern-day democratic society would hold so much stock in royal lines of succession. I mean, I can see that it is the rule of law in this particular land, So one might want to follow the law whether they agree with the system or not. It is the system, so if you don't follow it, chaos might ensue, which is what happened. But really, when you read about what actually happened in history, in England particularly during the time of the War of the Roses, which Martin himself has said was a huge inspiration for this story, you can see that the line of succession was tossed aside, disregarded so much in real life history. It was even worse than what occurred in Game of Thrones. Also, as I played a clip in my original video where Renly said the line of succession didn't matter during Robert's Rebellion, so why should it matter now? Someone pointed out to me that this was just about the show and not the books. However, it was in the books, but in a different context. Renly did say it to Catelyn rather than Ned, and it was more of an afterthought in the books to justify what he was doing, whereas in the show, you felt that he really believed it and was trying to not only convince Ned, but also himself that he deserved to be king. Either way, it's still a very good point. Stannis is next in line according to the Baratheons. However, the Targaryens and those who support them like Dorne would consider them both usurpers, and Daenerys is the rightful heir to the throne. So the line of succession is actually a really flimsy thing, which I think was one of the main points of Season 2 and A Clash of Kings. So if you think it matters that Renly had no true claim, I think you're missing the entire point of the book/season. Every once in a while, a movie or book or TV show will have one line of dialogue that really sums up the whole story and explains it all in one simple line. For the show Lost, this came in a line of dialogue that John Locke said to Jack in the season 1 finale, where he told Jack that each and every one of them was brought to the island for purpose, and that it was the island that brought them there. I knew right then and there that line explained the entire series, and that any theories that didn't take this line into account were doomed to failure. And I was right, as most certainly that ended up being the case. Game of Thrones has such a line that explains somewhat the entire series, but more specifically, it explained all of Season 2, and this line was directly taken from the book, so it was originally written by George R.R. Martin, and it was his way of summing up A Clash of Kings, which is why the show wisely chose to keep it, as it also summed up what they were doing in Season 2. Now, I played this clip at the end of my last video, and I think all those people who challenged me failed to take this into account. So I'll play it again. This time, pay closer attention to it, because it is George talking to the audience, summing up in one line the whole fight over the throne that occurs throughout A Song of Ice and Fire.
Power is a curious thing, my lord. Are you fond of riddles?
Why? Am I about to hear one?
3 great men sit in a room, a king, a priest, and a rich man. Between them stands a common sellsword. Each great man bids the sellsword kill the other 2. Who lives, who dies?
Depends on the sellsword.
Does it? He has neither crown, nor gold, nor favor with the gods.
He has a sword, the power of life and death.
But if it's swordsmen who rule, why do we pretend kings hold all the power? When Ned Stark lost his head, who was truly responsible? Joffrey, the executioner, or something else?
I've decided I don't like riddles.
Power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall.
Power resides where men believe it resides, not where some stupid rulebook that is all too easily tossed aside says it should. Ned and Stannis didn't understand this, which is why they both failed. People like Tywin, Varys, and Littlefinger understand this, which is why they fared much better. Which leads me to the main thing I wanted to talk about, and that is people got too caught up on Stannis versus Renly. They were missing the bigger, more important picture of Stannis versus Tywin. Because Renly isn't the point. I was never claiming that Renly was a genuine or genius player of the Game of Thrones. Tywin was, which is why he defeated Stannis. As I pointed out in my previous video, Tywin made an alliance with the Tyrells even though they had betrayed him by siding with Renly. And this is something Stannis refused to do. Instead, he let his pride get in his way. In my previous video, I played a clip of Stannis saying that Robb Stark and Renly were both thieves and that they'll bend the knee or he'll destroy them. That may sound cool or badass, but ultimately it's stupid politics and the main reason why he lost. If Tywin had that same attitude when an alliance with the Tyrells was proposed, he would have lost too. But even someone as prideful and as arrogant as Tywin knew when to swallow his pride because it was good politics. Stannis didn't, which is why he lost. Now, if you want to argue books versus show, sure, Stannis didn't react that same way in the books. In fact, I'd say the way he reacted in the books was actually far worse. As in the books, Maester Crescent suggested an alliance with either Robb or Renly, and Stannis actually seemed to be considering it until Melisandre and Selyse told him not to, and then Stannis quickly changed his mind and did whatever he was told. So in the books, he wasn't just prideful, but he was also weak-willed and did whatever Melisandre told him to, which, by the way, is further evidence that had Book Stannis become king, he would have simply just done Melisandre's bidding. So either way, Stannis was not smart by quickly dismissing an alliance and instead let the fact that he was supposed to be king by rule of law that no one else gave a shit about dictate his actions, which is why he lost. So, ultimately, is it all Stannis' fault? No. As I said, that was poorly worded, and in fact, it was meant to be a bit tongue-in-cheek and not taken completely literally. Many people are to blame, like Joffrey, Ned, Cersei, Renly, Tywin, Robert, and many others. How much is Stannis to blame? Somewhat. Definitely more in the show than he is in the books, as in the show, had he not ordered Melisandre to kill Renly, the forces of the Stormlands and the Reach, with an alliance of the North, would have very easily defeated the Lannister army, and then the North would have very easily been able to deal with the Ironborn, and then there'd be peace in Westeros, rather than a feast for crows and a bloody mess that was described in the book, which led to the Sparrow movement and all the chaos that they were responsible for. However, in the books, the chaos wouldn't have ended there, as Renly would still be feuding with other lands. However, it wouldn't have been as bad as when the Lannisters won. However, in both the books and the show, Stannis failed because he was not good at playing the Game of Thrones like people like Tywin Lannister. Otherwise, he would have swallowed his pride, made an alliance in order to defeat the Lannisters, and then could have made his move to take the crown for himself. Something that someone who was smarter and better at playing the Game of Thrones would have done. As regardless of whether or not by law you should be proper king, laws only hold as much power as people believe them to hold, as power resides where men believe it resides. So that's it for my How Much Is Stannis to Blame video. Be sure to check out my channel for many other Game of Thrones videos, particularly as we count down towards Season 6, and make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.